Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you today on the topic of trauma in children and youth. And it's a real pleasure to be with you this morning. And it speaks to the interest in this topic, looking at all the individuals that are here. And this topic really is an unfortunate reality for many children and youth in our community. So what I'm going to cover today is just a brief overview on trauma. I'll start with a definition, the impact of childhood trauma. How might you know if a child has experienced or is experiencing trauma? And just some strategies on ways that you can support a child or a youth with a trauma history. So childhood trauma constitutes experiences where there is a threat to the life of a child or youth or to that child's physical well-being. And the threat may be real or it may be perceived as such by the child. Trauma also constitutes experiences where children are exposed to violence and fear for the lives or the safety of another individual, often a caregiver. Undoubtedly, under these circumstances, children often have strong emotions and physical reactions. And we often talk about the fight, flight, or freeze response, which is essentially when you're encountered with a danger. One option is to try to fight the danger. Another option, as a way to stay safe, is to flee from the danger. Often for children, it's a freeze response. In other words, trying to sort of become invisible so that you don't pose a threat or might be overlooked by the individual who's posing a danger. There are many, many experiences that might constitute a traumatic experience. Some of them are interpersonal in nature, so they involve individuals. Others are not interpersonal in nature, so they would involve things like motor vehicle accidents, natural disasters. One of the types of traumatic experiences that I want to just focus on a little bit more is child abuse and neglect, because it is the most common form of trauma, and it almost always occurs within a caregiving system. In talking about child abuse and neglect, we typically talk about 5 types: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional or psychological abuse. That's characterized typically by a caregiver who's threatening violence towards their child or is verbally abusing their child, denigrating them, telling them they're no good, putting them down. Neglect is another form of maltreatment, and this is when a caregiver fails to provide for the needs of a child, be they physical, emotional, or doesn't protect the child so that the child is at danger of being hurt. And neglect can take the form of physical neglect, medical neglect, dental neglect, educational neglect, emotional neglect. And finally, there's exposure to intimate partner violence or domestic violence. We used to call this witness to domestic violence, but the research is now showing that a child doesn't have to witness violence between 2 individuals to experience trauma, but simply needs to be exposed to it, whether they see it, hear it, or are exposed to the aftermath, whether that be injuries on the part of the caregiver that's been hurt, or other forms of distress by the caregiver that's been hurt. So now that I've just reviewed the 5 different types, how frequent are they? So just in terms of statistics, This comes from the Ontario Incident Study of Child Abuse and Neglect, and this is an incident study that's conducted every 5 years, so there should be more recent data that will be coming out soon. But the most recent data from 2013, basically what they did in this study is they took a random sample of some of the child welfare agencies in Ontario and tracked the kinds of referrals, the kinds of calls that came to their attention over a 3-month period. And based on that, they generated estimates at the provincial level. And what they found is that among the investigations that were substantiated, in other words, there was enough evidence to show that this form of maltreatment had occurred, the type of maltreatment with the highest incidence was exposure to intimate partner violence in almost half of the substantiated investigations, followed by neglect, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse. So I'm guessing that many of us here interact with children and youth and might wonder, how do I know if a child is in need of help or protection? How do I know if a child might be experiencing trauma? In general, what we say is if you notice any sort of change in the way that the child or the youth previously was, that's an indication that something is going on. It may not be abuse, neglect, trauma, but it does indicate that there might be a need for protection. So that's, I think, the common rule is anytime you notice that the child doesn't seem to be like the way they used to be, that's an indication. In terms of other indicators, we can talk about physical indicators, behavioral, verbal interactions. So I'll just summarize a few. In terms of physical appearance, well, some obvious ones in terms of maybe physical maltreatment would be bruises, injuries, that when explained by a child, by their caregiver, just doesn't seem to add up or make a lot of sense. Indicators around hygiene of the child, clothing, hunger, missing a lot of appointments, especially within the school context. Those could be indicators that something is going on for the child and for their family, and that there may be a need for help. The behavioral indicators seem to be the biggest ones for children and for youth. And here it could take the form of things like a child who seems distressed around certain individuals or around having to transition to go back home. Self-harm or engaging in behavior that's reckless or might put their safety at risk. I think a big one for all of us is aggressive behavior, whether that's physical or verbal. A child who's withdrawn, seems very nervous, inhibited. A child who reacts quite strongly to touch. A child who has difficulties concentrating or has a lot of motor activity, seems to be what we call hyper a lot and can't seem to sit still, is often restless and jittery. In terms of verbalizations, we can pick up on some of the things that children and youth tell us, often around themselves in times when they're struggling. You know, I'm no good, I'm bad, I'm useless, I can't do anything right. Or even just thinking about the verbalizations they have around people in their immediate environment. How do they talk about their caregivers, their siblings? And finally, interactions with peers, with adults, with caregivers. Are you observing aggression, clinginess? How, especially in the context of childhood maltreatment within the home, what are the interactions like between the caregiver and the child? So those are just some of the many, many indicators that might prompt you to a child who's in distress and a family that's in need of help. So what do the effects of childhood trauma look like? Well, they look like all of the things that we've just been talking about here in terms of some of the behavioral indicators, the physical indicators, that child in relation to other individuals and the kinds of verbalizations that they're making. Those are all effects of childhood trauma. But more formally, in terms of diagnosis, we often talk about trauma in the context of a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. And I won't go into this in great detail because I do want to save time for other things, but in general, it's an individual, whether it's a child, a youth, or an adult. These criteria apply to everyone in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. But in terms of a child or a youth, it's re-experiencing the traumatic event, whether it's in distressing memories and flashbacks and nightmares. So it's as if the child is back in the event that was highly distressing and traumatic for them. Of course, with such distressing reminders, there's intense reactions. And the reactions could be at an emotional level, at a physical level. And sometimes we see this, for instance, a child who's exposed to two individuals that are having an argument suddenly becomes very frightened and goes and hides somewhere. Or a child on the playground where there might be two peers play fighting, tries to break it up and tells them to stop and becomes highly distressed at the thought of two individuals having an argument or play fighting. Those are some intense reactions that sometimes, if we don't know that that child has a trauma history, might strike us as being quite exaggerated in nature. But once you understand maybe some of the trauma that they've experienced, it makes a whole lot of sense. Avoidance. Well, because these memories can sort of hit you out of nowhere and be very distressing, a child or a youth that meets criteria for PTSD will try to avoid any and all reminders, because why would they want to feel that distress? So anything that might be linked to a memory would be avoided. I'll skip to the increased arousal before I go to the fourth symptom. The increased arousal is basically at a physiological level. A child or a youth who seems very hypervigilant about their surroundings, has an exaggerated startle response, may have difficulties with sleep and eating and concentration. And finally, the negative changes in thoughts and mood. This is a new sort of category that was added to the most recent statistical manual in 2013. And it's the attempt by the developers to acknowledge complex trauma in the sense that trauma can really, really change the way a child or a youth thinks about themselves, thinks about others, and thinks about the world around them, and can significantly impact their mood and their interest in things that previously they found pleasurable and interesting. And I'll talk more about this in a bit. All right. So one way to think about traumatic experiences is through a diagnostic lens, like the PTSD, which I've just presented. However, there are many individuals that do not meet criteria for PTSD, because it's a bit of an artificial system where you have to have a certain number of criteria to make the cutoff. And this does not mean that an individual who is sort of sub-threshold isn't suffering and isn't in distress. Many of us working in the area of trauma, we do talk about PTSD as well as many other diagnoses that children often meet. I think on average, especially children in child welfare, have about 5 diagnoses following a traumatic experience. One way to think about that, how do you make sense of all of these diagnoses, and how do you even work with a child who has so many diagnoses, is to think about a complex developmental trauma perspective. And here the idea is that early experiences of trauma, especially within the caregiving system, derail really, really important developmental processes. Things that we've all heard about, like attachment, emotion regulation, sense of self as an agent of change. In other words, that you have some agency in the world around you and a voice. All of those, and of course, brain development, right? So all of those things are really, really significant developmental processes that rely on a well-functioning caregiving system. So especially within the context of child abuse and neglect, which typically happens early in a child's life, it's within the context of caregivers who are supposed to be caring for a child. It's often of long duration and severe in nature. This complex developmental trauma perspective really fits. And what it basically says is when these key developmental processes are derailed, it will look like all of those diagnoses that these children often receive. It will look like oppositional defiant disorder. It will look like ADHD. It will look like anxiety, depression, PTSD. So it's one way to sort of understand some of the core developmental processes that are disrupted and that can present in these various forms. I'll just illustrate a little bit because this is a complicated slide, but just thinking about attachment, because I think that that's sort of a term in an area in which there's a lot of interest, and rightly so. If we think about even an infant who's preverbal, having a caregiver who's responsive to an infant's needs, who's consistent, predictable, and sensitive and effective in their responses, that builds the attachment relationship. That builds the emotional bond between that infant and the caregiver. And even though the child is preverbal, they're internalizing messages about themselves as an individual that's really worthy of care. They're internalizing messages or schemas about the other person, like, well, there's people in the world that are really trustworthy that I can depend on. And they're formulating ideas about the world as well, that the world is a safe, predictable place where my needs can be met. So you can imagine how a caregiving system that isn't responsive, isn't sensitive, isn't predictable, is harsh, can really derail all of those kinds of key messages that infants and young children internalize about themselves, people around them, and the world in general. Also, attachment really is the building block for some of these other developmental processes. So through attachment, the child learns about regulation, because they can't regulate when they're very young. And so their caregiver helps them to regulate. When they're crying, the caregiver will soothe them. When they're hungry, the caregiver will feed them. When they want to play, the caregiver will play with them. And eventually, that infant, that young child, learns to internalize all of those strategies around self-regulating that initially are done by the primary caregiver. You can see, though, within the context of an attachment relationship that isn't working well, there will be issues around emotion regulation, because the child hasn't learned how to effectively identify, manage, and express their feelings, and or may have been exposed to an environment where emotions often led to people shutting down or people being hurt. And so that whole idea of feelings and what to do with them, that isn't a developmental process that they've adequately gone through. So that's just to illustrate how complex developmental trauma works with regards to attachment, emotion regulation, and also, of course, with brain development. So a child who's growing up in an environment where they're continually concerned about their emotional and physical safety, that part of the brain that's helping them to survive and manage is the part that's the most developed, and it's at the expense of developing other parts of the brain around emotions, the frontal cortex around problem solving, planning, those sorts of things. Of course, this is not to say that those developmental processes can never be back on track. That's in fact what many interventions try to do, is try to put children's development back on track by working on such key areas as attachment, emotion regulation, sense of agency, etc. Okay, so what can we all do as a way to support a child who has experienced trauma? And here I think another buzzword, in addition to attachment that we often hear in the field, is trauma-informed care or trauma-sensitive responding. What does that mean? It basically means that we're aware of how common trauma is in children and youth. We're aware of the impact, and we're aware that we need to look beyond the presentation of the child and the youth, especially beyond their behavioral presentation, to really get at the root of what might be going on for them. And that's a trauma-sensitive response. The literature on resilience, in other words, how to promote resilience in a child, which is basically a child who's functioning the way another child who hasn't experienced trauma would be functioning. So resilience does not mean that a child who has experienced trauma is thriving. It's just that they're doing pretty good, considering all that they've been through compared to someone that hasn't been through that. Another concept around resilience is that you can be functioning in a resilient manner in one area of your life, whether it's at school or peers, but not in other areas. So it's not a trait of an individual. It could be domain specific, and it could certainly change over time as circumstances in the life of the child change. So what we know from the resilience literature is the biggest factor, and here's where we all play key roles, is in our relationships with children and youth. So what the literature shows is that a child or a youth who has experienced trauma, who has at least one relationship in their life, whether it's a teacher, a coach, an aunt, anybody, where they feel supported, where they feel understood, that is a key factor to promoting resilient functioning. So here I think is where we all play really important roles in the lives of children and youth that we interact with. I want to present just another concept. Some of these concepts are overlapping, and that's okay. It's just presenting them in different ways. One of the ways we talk about understanding trauma and the sort of changes in thoughts going back to the PTSD criteria is in terms of this invisible suitcase, which this child or this youth is carrying here. And the idea is that many children, many youth who have trauma histories, typically complex trauma histories, so trauma within the caregiving system, come with this invisible suitcase that's filled with all sorts of thoughts and beliefs about themselves, about others, about relationships, and about the world in general. So ideas that make a lot of sense based on their experiences. I will eventually get hurt by you. You will eventually hurt me. I'm bad, I'm worthless, I'm unlovable. You will reject me. I am powerless, I am helpless. And it makes a lot of sense that with all of these beliefs in this invisible suitcase that they carry with them at all times, those beliefs will impact the way children feel, the way they behave, and the way they interact with others, typically in very challenging ways for an individual who's interacting with this child or this youth. And I guess one of the biggest ways that we could respond in a trauma-sensitive manner is to always keep that idea of the invisible suitcase in mind, so that when you have a child who's acting quite aggressively, whether it's physical or verbally, you can think about, what is the purpose of that behavior and how does that relate to some of the core beliefs that they've internalized based on the trauma that they've experienced. And that will help us to really connect with the child. I think it would help us to manage our reaction as well, because we're not just reacting to how challenging the behavior is, but we're seeing that child's behavior at a deeper level and at a level of hurt and trying to keep themselves safe. Just got a couple of more slides. Again, this might overlap with what we've already spoken of, but I wanted to present it nonetheless. So now that we know about the invisible suitcase, what can we do? And in terms of some of these strategies, they're not at an intervention level per se, so I'm not talking about psychological interventions per se, although we can talk about that. And they certainly overlap with some of these strategies. But just in our interactions with children and youth, in whatever capacity you work with them, what are some ways to respond in a trauma-informed or trauma-sensitive manner? The first is to create safety. This of course, is the foundation. So one is to always monitor children and youth that you have concerns about. And if there are concerns around their safety, around their well-being, we need to act and we need to contact the appropriate authorities if we have safety concerns around children and youth that we interact with. But even when children are physically safe and are no longer experiencing trauma, they might not feel emotionally safe, right? Because just because you've removed a child or a youth from an environment where their safety was being compromised doesn't mean that they still don't feel unsafe and scared about their well-being. And ways to sort of promote a sense of safety is to be a consistent individual in that child's life, to be a predictable and safe individual in that child's life, to be dependable and trustworthy. Through that structure, through that predictability and consistency, a child or a youth will eventually start to feel more safe at an emotional level. Of course, the biggest way that we could help children and youth who have experienced trauma is through our relationships with them. So again, it's by understanding all of their challenging behaviors through a developmental complex trauma lens and responding at that level in terms of what does that behavior signify, as opposed to at a behavioral level through punishments and rewards. That's simply missing the mark. And it's a reaction that many children and youth with trauma histories are very accustomed to, but it serves to continue to make them feel unsafe and unheard because we're not getting at what's really driving the behavior, which is layered in all of their complex trauma history. So things like compassion, empathy, helping them to label what may be going on for them, helping them to regulate, to manage their feelings would be really, really important. And some of you may have heard of this, and I don't know where it comes from, but it's that idea of the time when you least want to be around the child is the time when they probably need you the most. Because a child who's quite dysregulated and is acting out means that they really don't have the strategies to cope with whatever it is that they're experiencing, and they're relying on you as the adult to help them, not to sort of punish them or put them in a timeout. So these are strategies that we never use with the parents that we work with. So self-regulation, we often talk about that, right, in terms of emotion regulation and what does that mean. So as I was presenting before in terms of some of the key developmental processes that are often derailed as a function of complex trauma, a big one is emotion regulation. So a child might not have been exposed to models in their caregiving environment that displayed effective emotion regulation, right? So emotions might have been something that have become very scary and something we don't think about. So you'll often find children that are almost really detached from their internal world in terms of what they're feeling. So emotion regulation is around helping children and youth to identify, label what the emotion is that they could be feeling, helping them to find ways to regulate or manage it, and helping them to find ways to appropriately and effectively express it. And here's where we play a key role as adults interacting with children and youth who have trauma histories. So some of those behavioral indicators that this child is dysregulated means I've got to go in there as an adult, stay with them, help them to figure out what it is that's going on for them at an emotions level that's being displayed in terms of their behaviors, validate that they have every right to feel that way, and then help them to problem solve together. How can we sort of address this? What can we do to make this feel better? The other thing is when we think about children and youth that have trauma histories, it's often in the sense of the deficits, all of the things that they're not achieving, all of the problems and difficulties that they're experiencing. And I would argue that for these children and for these youth, and even for their families, there's always areas where they're doing well. There's always areas of strength and competence. And one of the things we need to do is identify those areas and build those areas. So for a child who, might be struggling academically, but there's some aspect of the school environment that really interests them, to see if there's ways with the school that they have opportunities to engage in that, so that it builds their sense of self-efficacy, their sense of competence, and also their sense of agency, that idea that I do have competencies and that when I express myself, people listen to me, and I can actually affect change in my environment. And this is a feeling that's really counter to the feeling that they've often had as a result of their trauma experiences, which is one of powerlessness, helplessness. So things were done to them, decisions are made for them, and they have no sort of voice or say in the matter. So the more that we could sort of promote the fact that we want to listen to them, and that they have competencies and we want to help them build that will help a lot towards healing. I'm almost there. The other one is to help build connections, right? So the more that children are connected to other individuals, to their community, that promotes a sense of belonging, and that's a healing response as well. Finally, we need to understand that children and youth are not going to heal from trauma in isolation. They're within a caregiving system, they're within a school system, they're within their communities, they have peers, sometimes they're within a child welfare system. So we need to help and we need to collaborate with all of those systems when we're trying to address the trauma that a child or a youth has experienced. And in particular for a family, to understand that typically families try their best, and if a child or a youth is struggling, it's indicative of difficulties at a more systemic level, like you were saying, Kelly, with your case study. And we need to engage everyone that plays a role in the life of that child if we truly, truly want to address the trauma history. And finally, the last thing is simply to understand and manage our own reactions. Interacting with children that have complex trauma histories can be very trying, oftentimes because of their difficulties in emotion regulation and their attachment difficulties. All of that sort of can come out towards us in their behaviors and their verbalizations in a way that can sometimes be very hurtful, can make us feel very frustrated and angry and want to make us lash out at the child. And it's incumbent on us, the more that we recognize our reactions and understand where they're coming from, and maybe what the purpose is on the part of the child, whether it's conscious or subconscious, the more that we can react in a trauma-sensitive way to some of those strong reactions that we also might have in interacting with children and youth. So I'll leave it at that. I will just say here that there's resources as well. These are some of my go-to books. Daniel Siegel, who talks a lot about the whole brain child, and there's probably some of you here that are aware of his work. Gottman, around raising an emotionally intelligent child. And many, many really wonderful websites that have lots of resources around trauma.
And we will be posting that in Sunday school. And I thought maybe
The following program contains mature subject matter. Viewer discretion is advised.
With you folks, I want to speak, there we go, fundamentally about the 1 in 6 men who've experienced childhood sexual abuse, the 1 in 4 men who've experienced moderate to severe physical abuse, and what's the background in terms of their gender identity that can help inform us in terms of how we can provide care to boys, male youth, and men. That's my mug there. Just to say, if people aren't familiar, Men in Healing is a clinic in town focusing on men's mental health. I think our flagship program, though, is also called Men in Healing, which is confusing, but it's a treatment program for men who've experienced childhood trauma, among our other services. So today, I'm going to tell you a little story about this context. The average age for male sexually abused, for male children sexually abused, is between 9 and 10. The average age for men attending this dedicated treatment program to address childhood trauma is 45. So on average, the men who walk into our office experience 3.5 decades of suffering, suffering that is needless, and we've got to somehow do a better job to open the doors wider in our communities to serve boys, male youth, and men so that they don't have to go through that, their families don't have to go through that, and as a community, we don't have to go through that. That's what I want to talk about today. To try to understand that gap which is much longer for men than for women to attend care, we've got to look at the underpinnings of masculinity. Now, really, I should be talking about masculinities because we're from all stripes of life. There's not one form of masculinity, but we do have a masculinity embedded in our dominant culture. So I want to speak to a little bit of that in my time today. And I want to reference some backdrop materials that we use to inform our programming. The first one is called the Male Code. And despite its origin, which is from the 70s, it seems to still hold true for the vast number of men that we serve, and I think, again, in terms of what we see in the community. According to the theorists, 4 separate but intertwined codes that govern men's behavior that we could say are the primary learning codes for boys in their quest to become men. And here's the first one. The notion of the rugged individual, that as guys we're supposed to solve our own problems, that we're supposed to be self-reliant. And despite the fact that we're all social beings, we are social animals, pack animals by nature, masculinity seems to compel this directive to boys and young men, to the point that as guys we don't even ask for directions when we get lost. Of course, we have our friend Mr. Google Maps or whatever, but still fundamentally this is an issue. And of course, if guys were truly rugged, truly tough, well, why would we then drink and drug more than women? Why would we compose most of the visible homelessness. Why would men commit suicide 3 times the rate of women? So this should be around quotation marks. There's nothing rugged about masculinity. It's just a portrayal of it. Here's another issue that is a barrier for men to seek help. Is this notion that compared to women, men are much more invested in a comparative analysis of social standing due to their masculinity. And we have lots of representations of who are the big men in our communities and all the things you benefit from in holding a higher social stature. It could be you have more shiny things in life. It could be you have a greater availability of sex partners. These are the conferred benefits to being higher up in the chain. But we also know there's huge deficits and suffering attached to being lower on this chain of masculine command. So one of our programs we offer is in combination with the Ottawa Mission, as you know, one of our agencies that serve the homeless population. Well, those guys don't have something in their pockets that I'm going to assume that most of us do, and that are keys. Keys that suggest we can enter a door and close it behind us. Keys that represent a sense of privacy, keys that represent safety. These are important values that, again, the vast majority of us hold, some do not. Those are men lower on the pecking order. We know as well that men have this historic relationship to aggression and violence. And, you know, whether it be from defenders of the home to the warrior caste, this has been also part of men's history over the ages. And while, you know, there are certain aspects with all these codes that they're changing, you know, if we had any doubt, we could do a little field trip after today to the detention center and just count how many folks have been arrested for crimes of violence, and we would know men would be the far majority of that population. This last one I want to split in two, and I think it's more helpful to split their original wording, David and Brendan's, of no sissy stuff. So one is that for a boy to become a man in that journey, fundamentally, there's going to be aspects of his personhood that he may have to split off because of the perception that those qualities are feminine. Okay? You know, that boy who may have liked to dance, to perform, to be flamboyant, may well learn quickly that those are not inherent qualities typified for men. And so in his quest to become a guy, he may have to give up those qualities, leaving him more constricted in his sense of being. And what we know psychologically seems to be something like this. They reject this part of themselves, they project it on the other, being girls or women, and then that allows the potential for those qualities to be used as a put down or an insult or a degradation of the other. So, if you follow this line of thinking, possibly we here find the bedrock of misogyny in our culture due to the strict adherence of masculinity. Yet we can also see a similar play at hand in terms of masculinity in the sense of stripping off components of oneself if they could be perceived at all to be homosexual in origin. So that boy or male youth may say, wow, that dancing, that dress, that performance, or whatever that gendered stereotype is, it could be seen as, I got to give this up, or else people will see me as gay. And then the same psychological journey, the stripping off part of oneself, projecting it on the other in this case would be gay men, and then fertile territory, again, to put them down, discriminate, judge, whatever. We may find the bedrock of homophobia. I believe these are all ways that prevent men from seeking care of their wounds. So if we had to come up with one word only for all of this jazz, we might find masculinity is defined as invulnerable. If invulnerability is code word for masculinity, then that boy cannot say, he was sexually abused, he was, harmed in any way. Because invulnerable people cannot be harmed by definition. So here's the challenge of how we can shift that perspective so that that child, that male youth, that man can say, hi, I've been harmed. I was sexually abused, and I need help. Those two questions are the real kickers about all this gendered lens. Why don't men ask for help? Why don't men find the means to acknowledge their own victimization? Even the word victim is problematic for men who've been victimized. In your questioning style, if you're in frontline work, be very creative. Just avoid that word victim and you'll get more response from your male clients. I'm not being flagged yet on time, so I'm going to keep rolling along here. Here's another interpretation lens into masculinity. It's by a different theorist, a fellow by the name of Pleck, and he's looking at the underbelly of masculinity and how individual guys hold it. And again, this is good theory for thought. It's also what we teach our clients because we have to go through this material on masculinity in order to find a right place to work with men around their healing journeys. According to Pleck, there are 3 separate but intertwined codes that affect this underbelly of how men hold their pain. Here's the first one. It's called discrepancy strain. It's about guys who cannot live up to that idealized sense of self. Now, we can all, I think, identify. If I ask you all, how's your self-esteem doing today? This is what would be going on in your head. This is up here, an idealized sense of self. So this morning, you'd want to get up early to get your workout in, then get home to cook that organic breakfast for your family, and then, of course, come here early because you're a keen learner, but, knock off some emails from your job because you're a responsible worker. These are very, very high standards. Generally speaking, we're down here. And the bigger the gap you hold between your idealized self and your true sense of self, you're going to have a harder time with your self-esteem. Okay? If you're a little bit more gentle about what you could expect each day and you're really honest about all the good stuff you do accomplish, chances are you're going to hold better esteem. The same is true around masculinity. For example, if this is your sense of this is where you sleep at night, well, you're not going to be anywhere close to where you think you should. And, I think strain is a good way to depict that. Here is another notion of that underbelly of masculinity. Pleck calls it trauma strain, but it's different than how we're using trauma as a panel. And this is saying that everyday boyhood, everyday lives of young men are filled with ritual experiences, developmental experiences that in reflection we could see now as being traumatic. So we're not talking here about physical abuse, sexual assault, or things like that. We're talking about what guys do. If it's everything from, we've heard reference to bullying, we've certainly could be talking about reference to hazing. We can talk about these ritual traumas of inclusion. In my neighborhood, our community is being braced for Panda, but it's not Panda Fest, the football game between Carleton and Ottawa U. What? Panda game, okay. And the cops are on watch. We're getting flyers in the mail about how they're going to, be watching the community, and the students are saying they're going to clean up as a volunteer crew. Next day, it's going to be widespread alcohol and drug consumption. It always is. Maybe it always will be. I don't know. But how much of that pressure to overconsume? We know dozens of young people die each year, throughout Canada, throughout the U.S., just from alcohol poisoning and freshman activities. This is part of trauma-strained men. Young men seem to embody this in so many ways. And here's the last category according to Pleck. It's called dysfunction strain. dysfunction strain, like as a guy, you work hard and you work hard to try to pull it off, and yet that effort comes back and bites you in the ass. So let me give you a couple examples. You know, if you were brought up in a certain way as a guy, and now you're in an opportunity, a situation to have your own family, and you may say to yourself, you know, I want to have a family like the family I grew up with. And even my old man was a bit of a tyrant, say. At least we knew where each other stood, and things got done. No one had any doubt about where each other stood. And if that was your experience, and that was embodied in your sense of self, and as well as your thoughts and your emotional predilections, and you really believed that and really honored that past, you may find it one day, you may just find cops at your door to arrest you because you've just hit someone that you loved. Because that past and those thoughts and that emotional structure may lead oneself to domestic violence. Then we get calls at the clinic, hey, I've just been arrested, I don't know what to do. Or another one. Being a provider is really important as a guy, so I'm going to grow up and put food on the table for my family. That's really important for me. Not just food on the table, all the shiny things I didn't get as a kid, I want my kids to get. They may find at some point in their life their family walks out on him, his family walks out on him, because he's invested so much in his work, he's let his relationship investment lapse. So he's in crisis too. So I think this is where it leaves us. Some of this is talking just about general shame of men, the impossible standards that men can hold, and this is apart from the shame and from childhood trauma. And we also have to recognize there are issues of grandiosity embedded in the male code. That for boys and men, we are told we can take more than our share. And we can't forget that element in terms of our engagement with men. But somehow we've got to bring these two together. We've got to create places of safety for men in our communities. And if we can do so, maybe we can get some things done. So that's my time today. Thank you all for listening.